idea that the world was at the brink of nuclear war.
Everyone was scared,
Yeah.
primarily, not knowing what was going to happen.
These are the memories of the people who were first-hand witnesses to the events of October 1962. This was a time where families hurried to buy bomb shelters, sometimes paying as much as $5,000 for luxury models. Children in classrooms watched cartoon characters act out air raid drill procedures. Newspaper headlines blasted information about the threat of nuclear war. Citizens went to sleep with only one thought in their mind. Will they survive the night? This was the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the darkness of the Cold War, two world superpowers clashed in a constant and silent combat. The USSR, or the Soviet Union, and the United States of America's icy relationship following World War II led to many major issues that impacted not just the two countries, but the whole world. It all started with Fidel Castro, the man behind the Cuban Revolution who drove out the leader America strategically placed in Cuba. As mentioned by Raul Galvan, a Cuban native,
He was standing up to the U.S., which nobody had ever dared to do before.
the Bay of Pigs invasion and numerous other attempts to drive Castro out of power followed, but none worked. Castro, having lost his country's biggest trade ally, the USA, turned to the Soviet Union and its communist leader Nikita Khrushchev. Fearing a response to American missiles placed in Turkey, a NATO or North Atlantic Treaty Organization ally and a country which bordered the Soviet Union, U.S. President John F. Kennedy declared a new non-tolerance policy for nuclear weapons in Cuba. His worst nightmares, however, came true after an American U-2 plane took pictures of Soviet ballistic missiles being set up only 90 miles away from Florida. The date was October 14, 1962. After being alerted to the presence of the weapons the next morning, Kennedy wasted no time creating a special council including key government members, such as his brother and Attorney General Robert Kennedy and Robert S. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. All these people collectively created the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. Kennedy, a relatively young, inexperienced president at the time, could not make a plan of attack without consulting others first. He lacked the experience of Khrushchev, and he didn't have much information at first. Without a plan, he couldn't risk the widespread panic the public would feel if they knew the danger they were in. Because of this, Kennedy tried to maintain a typical schedule as to not arouse suspicion. Initially, there seemed to be only one solution EXCOM could come up with, a surprise bombing raid. Many of the over 100,000 Cuban exiles in Florida agreed with this, hoping it would eliminate Castro. However, discussion proved that this might not be the best route. As Undersecretary of State George Ball said, "This isn't the end, this is the beginning." Kennedy's abilities were underestimated considering his young age. He was not one for rash decisions or solely individual decisions. The consequences for a wrong choice were immense. This was something Robert McNamara realized as he told Robert Kennedy, Douglas Dillon, Secretary of Treasury, told Kennedy this, as he said, "The survival of our nation demands the prompt eliminations of offensive weapons now in Cuba." Robert McNamara, however, instead suggested a naval blockade. EXCOM quickly was divided into two sections, including Hawks, favoring military action immediately, or Doves, calling for a softer, cautious plan of attack. Air Force Chief Curtis LeMay told Kennedy some harsh, although true words. "You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President." After many long meetings, hours of careful thought and consideration of many risks, a decision was made. Kennedy would side with the Doves, and he ordered a naval quarantine since using the word blockade implied war. On October 22nd, Kennedy went on national television barely a week after being alerted to Soviet missile deployments 90 miles off the coast of Florida and in firing range of most of the United States.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Citizens were alarmed about their grim position, even though most people did not even realize how severe the circumstances actually were. It is arguable that this was the closest the world has ever been to nuclear war. On October 23rd, Kennedy signed the Quarantine Proclamation. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and America were meeting for the UN Security Council in New York City. Adlai Stevenson, the American ambassador, had called for the emergency meeting with the purpose of applying pressure on the Soviets to dismantle their missiles as soon as possible. Valerian Zorin, the Soviet ambassador, was ready for a battle. However, Stevenson skillfully maneuvered his way through the meeting, including revealing pictures of the missile sites proving what Zorin had declined to admit.
Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba?
Mr. Stevenson, would you continue your statement, please? You will receive the answer in the due course. Do not worry.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room.
In the days after Kennedy's speech, the world was on edge, as said by Jim Fitzpatrick, who was a high school student during this period of time.
Real tense. I remember being in the classroom, and the most tense part was when the blockade was on, and no one knew what the Russians were going to do.
Kennedy was especially stressed, worrying about the consequences if he had made the incorrect decision. As described by his brother, Kennedy's hand went up to his face and covered his mouth. He opened and closed his fists. The president's face seemed drawn, his eyes pained. The possibilities were scary, as the chance of the start of a major war at sea were large. After all, Khrushchev had declared his ships would not turn back its blockade, saying it was an American act of aggression. However, on October 24th, when denied access to Cuba, the Russian warships peacefully turned back. As said by the United States Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fella just blinked." October 26th was an important and dramatic day, as the eccentric Khrushchev sent a long, emotional letter to Kennedy claiming the missiles in Cuba would be removed immediately as long as the United States agreed to not invade Cuba. The letter at one point read, "If there is no intention to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this." That letter, however, failed to acknowledge the continued complexity of the still ongoing ordeal. In fact, the following day, October 27th, or Black Saturday, an American plane was shot down over Cuba by Soviet missiles. Major Rudolf Anderson, the pilot, died and his plane was destroyed. This event outraged citizens and the government. Fear was still a strong emotion. As Robert McNamara said, "I thought it was the last Saturday I would ever see." Finally, on October 28, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis came to a close with Khrushchev agreeing to remove the missiles publicly, while Kennedy agreed to not invade Cuba. The deal also included the United States removing their missiles from Turkey, but this was kept as a secret from the public. The Soviet missiles that almost caused a Third World War began to be dismantled that night at 5 p.m. The blockade stood until the missiles were completely destructed. The Cuban Missile Crisis was possibly the most influential event of the long Cold War. It showed the world the determination of the United States and the strength of its leader. John F. Kennedy stood up for his country in the whole world when the Soviet Union decided to put missiles in a very dangerous spot. Instead of engaging in a ballistic missile battle, he decided to go down a less violent route to rid his country and the whole world of possible termination. At the end of the day, mass deaths and complete destruction were averted by the choice of one man.